Have you ever wondered what drives someone to risk everything for a stranger? What compels a person to choose compassion over safety, humanity over hatred, even when the world around them has descended into madness? In the winter of 1944, deep within the snow-covered countryside of occupied France, such a choice would define the fate of two souls whose paths should never have crossed. This is the story of Sister Marie Clare, a French nurse whose unwavering dedication to healing would be tested in ways she never imagined, and Hans Miller, a wounded German soldier whose life hung in the balance between duty and conscience. What you're about to hear challenges everything we think we know about war, about enemies, about the thin line between survival and sacrifice, because sometimes, in the darkest moments of human history, light breaks through in the most unexpected places. Sometimes, a single act of mercy can echo through generations, reminding us that beneath the uniforms, beneath the flags, beneath all the reasons we're taught to hate, we are simply human beings capable of extraordinary grace. The year 1944 marked one of the bloodiest periods of the Second World War. Allied forces had landed in Normandy, pushing inland against fierce German resistance. Every village, every farmhouse, every hospital became a potential battleground. Medical personnel found themselves caught between their oath to heal and the brutal realities of a world at war. Sister Marie Clare had served at the makeshift field hospital near the village of Sainte Margarite for nearly 3 years. She had witnessed unspeakable horrors, tended to wounds that defied description, and held the hands of dying men who cried out for their mothers in languages she barely understood. Yet nothing had prepared her for what would unfold on that bitter December morning. The hospital itself was little more than a converted monastery, its ancient stone walls offering meager protection against both the elements and the chaos raging outside. Medical supplies were scarce, food even scarcer. The nuns and volunteer nurses worked around the clock, their faith and determination the only thing standing between life and death for countless wounded soldiers. Marie Clare had joined the convent at 19, driven by a calling to serve others that burned within her like an eternal flame. Her medical training had come later, born from necessity as the war consumed everything in its path. She learned to set bones by candlelight, to perform surgery with improvised instruments, to make impossible decisions about who could be saved and who could not. The other sisters often marveled at her composure under pressure, her ability to remain calm when artillery shells shook dust from the monastery ceiling, when the screams of the wounded echoed through the corridors like ghosts seeking peace. But Marie Clare carried her own private struggles, her own moments of doubt that she shared only with God in the quiet hours before dawn. On this particular morning, the first snow of winter had begun to fall, blanketing the countryside in deceptive beauty. The war seemed distant, almost peaceful, until the sound of approaching vehicles shattered the illusion. Medical transports were arriving, carrying fresh casualties from the front lines that had shifted dangerously close to their position. Marie Clare hurried to prepare the receiving ward, her practiced hands checking supplies, arranging instruments, steeling herself for whatever horrors the trucks might deliver. She had learned not to look too closely at faces anymore, not to wonder about the stories behind the wounds. Such thoughts made the work unbearable. The first casualties were French resistance fighters, their civilian clothes torn and bloodied, their eyes holding that hollow look she had come to recognize in those who had seen too much. She worked quickly, efficiently, her movements guided by years of experience and an unshakable determination to preserve life wherever possible. Then came the Allied soldiers, young men from America and Britain whose foreign accents reminded her of the world beyond this nightmare, of places where people still lived normal lives, where children played in streets that weren't pockmarked by bombs. She treated them with the same care she showed her own countrymen, because pain recognized no nationality, suffering knew no borders, but it was the final transport that would change everything. As the heavy doors of the truck swung open, Marie Clare caught sight of a figure huddled in the corner, barely conscious, wearing the unmistakable gray uniform of the German Wehrmacht. The other medical staff hesitated, uncertain, their training warring with their emotions, their duty conflicting with their humanity. The soldier was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with fair hair matted with blood and blue eyes that flickered between awareness and unconsciousness. His left leg was badly wounded, the makeshift bandages soaked through with blood, infection already setting in around the jagged edges of what appeared to be shrapnel wounds. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The other nurses looked to Marie Clare, waiting for her decision, knowing that whatever choice she made would ripple through their small community like stones thrown into still water. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the distance, the rumble of artillery reminded them all that the war was far from over. This was the moment that would define not just Marie Clare's life, but the lives of everyone in that small monastery hospital. The moment when she would have to choose between the easy path of turning away and the difficult path of staying true to her deepest convictions. The moment when she would discover just how far her compassion could stretch, how much her faith could endure. Hans Miller had been a reluctant soldier from the beginning. Drafted from his small Bavarian village at 19, he had dreamed of becoming a teacher, of spending his days with books and young minds eager to learn. Instead, he found himself thrust into a conflict that seemed to consume everything good in the world, leaving only ash and sorrow in its wake. He had served on the Eastern Front first, witnessing horrors that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. Then came the transfer to France, where the resistance fighters struck like ghosts in the night, where every shadow might conceal an enemy, where trust was a luxury no soldier could afford. The patrol that had ended with his wounding had been routine, or what passed for routine in those days. A sweep through the countryside, checking for partisan activity, securing supply routes. They had been ambushed just outside Sainte Margarite, caught in a crossfire that left half his unit dead and the rest scattered to the winds. Hans had dragged himself nearly 2 miles through the forest, leaving a trail of blood that he prayed his enemies wouldn't follow. Delirium from blood loss had set in, and he barely remembered the final stumbling approach to what he hoped might be sanctuary. All he knew was that he was dying, and that dying alone in a foreign forest seemed like the cruelest fate imaginable. Now, as consciousness flickered back like a candle in the wind, he found himself staring up at an unfamiliar ceiling, breathing air that smelled of antiseptic and incense. Voices spoke in rapid French around him, their tones urgent but not hostile. He tried to move, to understand where he was, but pain lanced through his leg like lightning, and darkness claimed him once again. When he next awakened, it was to find gentle hands changing his bandages, cleaning his wounds with a care that seemed impossible in a world gone mad. Through half-opened eyes, he saw her for the first time. A nun, young and determined, her movements precise and confident despite the obvious danger his presence represented to everyone in this place. Marie Clare worked in silence, her training taking precedence over the questions that swirled in her mind. Who was this young man? What circumstances had brought him to their door? Did he have family somewhere, people who wondered if he was alive or dead? She pushed such thoughts aside, focusing instead on the immediate task of preserving life. But as she worked, she couldn't help but notice the small details that made him human rather than simply enemy. The photograph tucked into his breast pocket, partially visible, showing what appeared to be an elderly couple standing before a modest farmhouse. The worn book of poetry in his pack, its pages marked with careful annotations in a neat scholarly hand. The wedding ring on a chain around his neck suggesting someone, somewhere, who waited for his return. These discoveries troubled her in ways she hadn't expected. It was easier to think of the enemy as faceless, as somehow less than human. But here was evidence of a life beyond the uniform, of hopes and dreams and connections that war had interrupted but not destroyed. Here was proof that the boy lying unconscious before her was someone's son, perhaps someone's husband, certainly someone who mattered to people who would never know what had become of him. The other sisters watched her work with a mixture of admiration and concern. They understood her commitment to healing, shared her belief that all life was sacred, but they also understood the risks they were all taking. If German patrols discovered their patient, if collaborators reported their actions, if anyone decided that harboring an enemy soldier was a betrayal too great to overlook, the consequences would be swift and terrible. Mother Superior Claudette had said nothing when Marie Clare carried the wounded soldier inside, but her eyes spoke volumes. This was a test of faith unlike any they had faced before, a challenge to their most fundamental beliefs about mercy, forgiveness, and the value of human life. The decision had been made in a moment of instinct and compassion, but now they would all have to live with the consequences. As night fell over the monastery, Marie Clare maintained her vigil beside the unconscious German soldier. She prayed for guidance, for wisdom, for the strength to see this through regardless of what tomorrow might bring. Outside, the war continued its relentless march, but inside these ancient walls, something different was taking root. Something that spoke to the better angels of human nature. Something that reminded them all why they had chosen lives of service in the first place. The real test, however, was yet to come, because when Hans Meller finally awakened fully, when he realized where he was and understood the incredible risk these women were taking for his sake, everything would change. The careful balance Marie Clare had maintained between duty and compassion would be pushed to its absolute limits, and she would discover truths about herself, about her faith, and about the power of human connection that would transform her understanding of what it truly meant to heal. The snow had turned to sleet by the third day, tapping against the monastery windows like skeletal fingers seeking entry. Marie Clare moved through her routines with mechanical precision, checking on her other patients while her thoughts remained anchored to the small room where Hans Müller drifted between consciousness and fevered dreams. She had spoken to no one about the moments when he stirred, when his eyes would flutter open and search the unfamiliar surroundings with confusion that gradually gave way to understanding. In those brief instances of clarity, she saw something that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Not the hardened gaze of a seasoned killer, but the lost expression of someone who had wandered too far from home and forgotten the way back. The infection in his leg had worsened despite her efforts. Without proper antibiotics, which were nearly impossible to obtain in their isolated position, she was fighting a losing battle against sepsis. His fever spiked during the long nights, and she found herself sitting beside his bed, cooling his burning skin with damp cloths while he muttered deliriously in German. Sometimes he called out for someone named Anna, his voice breaking with longing that transcended language barriers. Other times he recited what sounded like poetry, fragments of verses that spoke of fields golden with wheat and streams that sang through mountain valleys. These glimpses into his inner world only deepened Marie Clare's growing conviction that she was treating not a monster, but a man whose humanity had somehow survived the systematic brutality of war. Sister Bernadette approached her after morning prayers, her weathered face creased with concern that went beyond medical matters. The older nun had served through the Great War, had seen what happened to those who showed mercy to the wrong people at the wrong time. Her hands, permanently stained from years of mixing medicines, trembled slightly as she spoke. The villagers are asking questions about the extra supplies we have been requesting. Dr. Moreau suspects we are treating more patients than we report. If word reaches the wrong ears, if someone decides to investigate, we cannot protect ourselves with prayers alone. Marie Clare understood the warning embedded in those carefully chosen words. They were walking a tightrope stretched over an abyss, and every day they delayed making a decision, brought them closer to a fall that would destroy not just themselves, but everyone who depended on their care. The monastery housed 12 other wounded men, French resistance fighters and Allied soldiers whose lives hung in the balance. One wrong choice could doom them all. Yet when she returned to check on Hans that afternoon, she found him awake and alert, for the first time since his arrival. His blue eyes tracked her movement across the room, and she could see the questions forming behind his gaze. He tried to speak, his voice barely a whisper, and she instinctively moved closer to hear. "Where am I?" The words came in accented but clear French, surprising her with their fluency. "How long have I been here? Why are you helping me?" The directness of his questions caught her off guard. She had expected hostility, demands, perhaps threats. Instead, she heard genuine confusion mixed with something that sounded almost like gratitude. She found herself studying his face more carefully, noting the sharp cheekbones that spoke of recent hunger, the premature lines around his eyes that suggested he had seen too much for someone so young. "You are in a place of healing. You have been here 3 days. Your wounds were severe. The simple responses felt inadequate, but she was not ready for the deeper conversation she sensed approaching like storm clouds on the horizon. Hans struggled to sit up, wincing as movement sent fresh waves of pain through his damaged leg. His gaze swept the small room, taking in the religious iconography, the simple furnishings, the medical supplies arranged with careful precision. Understanding dawned slowly, and with it came an expression of wonder that transformed his entire face. "You are nuns, French nuns, and you are treating a German soldier." His voice held a note of disbelief, as if he were trying to convince himself that such a thing was possible in a world that seemed to have forgotten mercy entirely. "Why would you risk this?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was certain they should cross. Marie Clare felt the weight of her decision pressing down upon her, the magnitude of what she had set in motion becoming clearer with each passing moment. She could have offered him platitudes about Christian duty, about the sacred obligation to heal regardless of nationality or uniform. Instead, she found herself speaking a truth that surprised even her. "Because when I look at you, I do not see a German soldier. I see a young man who is far from home, who calls out for Anna in his sleep, who carries poetry in his pocket alongside photographs of people who love him. I see someone who needs healing, and that is what I do. That is who I am." The honesty of her response seemed to shatter something fragile in Hans Müller. His composure, maintained through months of military discipline and the necessity of survival, crumbled like ancient parchment exposed to flame. Tears tracked down his cheeks, and his voice broke as he spoke. "Anna was my wife. We were married just 2 weeks before I was conscripted. The photograph you must have seen, that is her parents' farm where we planned to live after the war, where we dreamed of raising children and growing old together, watching the seasons change. I have not heard from her in 8 months. I do not even know if she is alive." The raw grief in his words hit Marie Clare like a physical blow. She had prepared herself to treat his wounds, to maintain professional distance, to do her duty without becoming emotionally involved. But this glimpse into his shattered life, this evidence of love and loss that mirrored the pain she saw in every patient who passed through their doors, broke down barriers she had not realized she was maintaining. She found herself sitting on the edge of his bed, her hand reaching out instinctively to offer comfort, before she caught herself. The gesture froze halfway, her fingers suspended in the air between professional restraint and human compassion. In that moment of hesitation, something fundamental shifted in the space between them. Hans noticed her aborted movement, and something like gratitude flickered in his eyes. Not for the comfort she might have offered, but for the recognition that she had wanted to offer it at all. In a world where enemies were expected to remain enemies, where uniform and nationality determined the limits of compassion, her momentary impulse toward kindness felt revolutionary. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor broke the spell that had settled over them. Marie Clare rose quickly, her movements suddenly brisk and professional as she checked his bandages one final time, But as she prepared to leave, Hans spoke again, his voice stronger now, filled with an urgency that made her pause. "Sister, if I die here, will you try to get word to Anna? Her name is Anna Muller, and she lives in Oberammergau. Will you tell her that I thought of her every day? That I never stopped loving her? That I am sorry for all the things this war has taken from us?" The request was impossible, dangerous beyond measure. Communication with enemy territory was not just forbidden, but potentially treasonous. Yet looking down at this young man who might not live to see another sunrise, Marie Clare found herself nodding before her rational mind could intervene. "I will try. If it is within my power, I will find a way to tell her." The promise settled between them like a sacred vow, binding them together in a conspiracy of hope that transcended the artificial boundaries war had drawn across the map of human hearts. As Marie Clare left the room, she carried with her the weight of that commitment and the growing realization that this German soldier had already changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Outside, the sleet continued to fall, and somewhere in the distance, the artillery had resumed its deadly conversation. But, inside the small room where Hans Müller lay, recovering from wounds that might yet kill him, something precious and fragile had taken root. Something that whispered of the possibility that even in the darkest chapters of human history, love could find a way to bridge any divide, mercy could flourish in the most unlikely soil, and hope could survive even when everything else had been stripped away. The real test of that hope, however, was approaching faster than either of them realized, because tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and choices that would determine not just whether Hans Müller lived or died, but whether the fragile connection forming between them could survive the harsh realities of a world determined to keep enemies apart. The fourth morning brought with it an urgency that could no longer be ignored. Hans's fever had broken during the night, but his leg showed signs of gangrene setting in around the deepest wounds. Marie Clare knew that without immediate surgical intervention, amputation might become the only option to save his life. The primitive conditions of their makeshift operating theater made such procedures nearly impossible, yet the alternative was watching him die slowly from blood poisoning. She had performed countless surgeries since the war began, her hands guided by necessity rather than formal training. But operating on an enemy soldier presented complications that went far beyond medical technique. The other patients would know what was happening. Word would spread through the small community of wounded men who looked to her for salvation. Questions would be asked that she was not prepared to answer. Hans seemed to sense the gravity of his situation when she examined his leg that morning. The smell of infection was unmistakable, and the angry red streaks climbing toward his knee told a story that needed no translation. He met her eyes without flinching, and she saw in them a resignation that was both heartbreaking and oddly comforting. Here was a man who had made peace with his mortality, who would not rage against death if it chose to claim him. "Do what you must, sister. I have already lived longer than I deserved after that ambush. If God means for me to die here, then perhaps this is his way of ensuring I cause no more harm to innocent people." His acceptance troubled her more than fear or anger might have. She had grown accustomed to patients who fought desperately against their fate, who pleaded for life with every breath. Hans Müller's quiet dignity in the face of death reminded her of the saints whose stories had inspired her vocation, men and women who faced martyrdom with serene faith rather than terror. The decision to operate was made easier by the arrival of Dr. Henri Moreau, the elderly physician who visited their facility twice weekly when travel conditions permitted. His weathered hands had guided Marie Clare through her first surgical procedures, and his presence always brought a sense of competence that steadied her nerves. But when she explained the situation in hushed tones, his reaction was immediate and uncompromising. "Absolutely not. We cannot risk it. The man is as good as dead anyway, and attempting surgery will only waste precious medical supplies while endangering everyone under this roof. Turn him over to the local authorities and let them deal with the situation." The coldness in his voice shocked her. Dr. Moreau had always preached that medical ethics transcended politics, that their oath to heal applied equally to all who sought their aid. Yet here he was, advocating for a course of action that violated everything he had taught her about the sanctity of life. The war, it seemed, had claimed another casualty in the gradual erosion of human compassion. Marie Clare found herself arguing with a passion that surprised them both. She spoke of their duty as healers, of the oath they had taken to preserve life, regardless of circumstances. She reminded him of the parable of the Good Samaritan, of Christ's commandment to love their enemies. Her words came in a torrent that seemed to pour directly from her soul, bypassing the rational calculations that normally governed her decisions. Dr. Moreau listened in silence, his expression growing more troubled with each point she raised. When she finally fell quiet, he studied her face with the intensity of a man trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become far more complex than he had anticipated. The silence stretched between them until she began to wonder if she had irreparably damaged their professional relationship. "You realize what you are asking, Marie Clare. Not just of yourself, but of everyone here. If this goes wrong, if we are discovered, the consequences will extend far beyond these walls. The resistance fighters we treat, the Allied soldiers who depend on our discretion, all of them will suffer for your decision to save one German boy." The weight of his words settled over her like a shroud. She understood the mathematics of war, the cold calculation that weighed one life against many. Hans Müller was a single soldier in an army of millions, while their facility represented hope and healing for dozens of men fighting against the occupation. From a purely tactical standpoint, the choice was obvious. Yet, something deeper than logic drove her response. Perhaps it was the memory of Hans calling out for Anna in his delirium. Perhaps it was the poetry she had glimpsed in his personal effects, evidence of a soul that appreciated beauty even in the midst of ugliness. Perhaps it was simply the recognition that if they abandoned their principles now, if they allowed pragmatism to override compassion, they would lose something essential about themselves that no military victory could restore. "I understand the risks, Doctor, but I also understand that we are more than the sum of our strategic value. We are human beings called to serve something greater than ourselves. If we let this man die, not because we cannot save him, but because we choose not to try, then we become something less than what we were meant to be." Dr. Moreau was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting between Marie Clare and the door that led to Hans Müller's room. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that seemed to encompass decades of difficult decisions and their inevitable consequences. "Very well, we will attempt the surgery. But understand that this is your responsibility, your choice. If complications arise, if discovery follows, you will bear the burden of those outcomes. I pray your conscience can live with whatever results from this decision." The operation took place that afternoon in the small room they had converted into a surgical theater. Dr. Moreau's hands proved steadier than his words had suggested, and Marie Clare assisted with a focus that blocked out everything beyond the immediate task of preserving life. They worked in near silence, their movements synchronized by years of collaboration and shared purpose. Hans remained conscious throughout much of the procedure, the limited supply of anesthetic insufficient to render him completely unconscious. His jaw was clenched against the pain, but he never cried out, never begged them to stop. Instead, he spoke quietly of Anna, of the farm where they had planned to build their life together, of the children they had hoped to raise in a world finally free from the madness of war. His voice became a lifeline that Marie Clare followed through the most difficult moments of the surgery. When her hands trembled with exhaustion, when the complexity of the wound seemed to overwhelm her limited skills, his steady recitation of memories and dreams provided an anchor that kept her focused on the ultimate goal of healing rather than the immediate obstacles that threatened to defeat them. The removal of infected tissue was painstaking work that required both precision and speed. Each cut had to be calculated to preserve as much healthy muscle as possible while eliminating the poison that threatened to spread throughout his system. Marie Clare found herself praying silently as she worked, not for divine intervention, but for the wisdom to make the right choices when medical knowledge reached its limits. Dr. Moreau's expertise proved invaluable in the most critical moments. His guidance helped her navigate complications that might have proven fatal in less experienced hands. Yet, even with his assistance, the outcome remained uncertain. They had done what they could, but infection was a cunning enemy that often returned stronger after apparent defeat. As they closed the surgical site and applied fresh bandages, Hans looked up at them both with an expression that combined gratitude with something approaching awe. His voice was weak but clear when he spoke, and his words carried the weight of a man who understood the magnitude of what had just occurred. "You have given me a gift I can never repay. Not just the chance to live, but the reminder that goodness still exists in this world. Whatever happens to me now, I will carry the memory of your kindness until my last breath. You have restored something in me that I thought the war had destroyed forever." Marie Clare felt tears threatening as she listened to his words. The emotional toll of the past few days was beginning to catch up with her, and the realization of what they had just accomplished was both overwhelming and humbling. They had not simply performed a medical procedure, they had affirmed the fundamental dignity of human life in the face of a conflict that seemed designed to strip away such affirmations. The recovery would be long and uncertain. Infection could still claim him despite their efforts, and even if he survived, his leg might never function normally again. Yet as Marie Clare watched Hans drift into a peaceful sleep, she felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with medical success and everything to do with moral certainty. She had chosen to see the man rather than the uniform, the soul rather than the nationality. In making that choice, she discovered something about herself that would define the rest of her life. Compassion was not a luxury that could be rationed according to political convenience. It was a calling that demanded everything, that asked no questions about the worthiness of its recipients, that recognized no boundaries save those imposed by fear and hatred. Outside the monastery walls, the war continued its relentless march toward an uncertain conclusion. Armies clashed across frozen fields, cities burned under bombardment, and countless individuals faced choices between survival and principle. But inside the small room where Hans Müller lay recovering, a different kind of victory had been won. A victory that proved love could indeed triumph over hate, that mercy could flourish even in the darkest soil, that the human spirit could rise above the artificial divisions that war sought to impose. The real test of that victory, however, still lay ahead. Because in the days to come, Marie Clare would discover that saving Hans Müller's life was only the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about duty, sacrifice, and the true meaning of faith. The choices she had made in those crucial hours would ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, creating consequences that neither she nor Hans could have anticipated. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of approaching vehicles suggested that those consequences were about to arrive much sooner than either of them was prepared to face. Prepared to face. The sound of engines grew louder, their mechanical growl cutting through the morning stillness like a blade through silk. Marie Clare felt her heart quicken as she recognized the distinctive rumble of German military vehicles. She moved to the window, her fingers gripping the stone sill as she watched a convoy of 3 trucks wind their way up the narrow road toward the monastery. Sister Bernadette appeared at her shoulder, her face pale with the kind of fear that comes from knowing too much about the consequences of discovery. The older nun's voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of prophecy in its trembling cadence. They are searching every building in the region. Word has reached them that wounded resistance fighters are being treated in unauthorized locations. Mother Superior is preparing to receive them in the main hall. Marie Clare's mind raced through possibilities, each more dangerous than the last. Hans was in no condition to be moved, and even if they could relocate him without reopening his surgical wounds, there was nowhere within the monastery walls that would remain hidden from a thorough search. The ancient building held few secrets that determined soldiers could not uncover. She found herself thinking of Anna Müller, somewhere in Bavaria, waiting for news that might never come. The promise she had made to Hans suddenly seemed both precious and impossible to fulfill. How could she tell this unknown woman about her husband's final days if those days were numbered in hours rather than years? The trucks ground to a halt in the courtyard below, their engines falling silent with mechanical finality. Heavy boots struck cobblestones as soldiers disembarked, their voices carrying upward in sharp German consonants that transformed the peaceful morning into something altogether more sinister. Marie Clare counted 12 men, their uniforms crisp despite the harsh weather, their weapons held with casual readiness that spoke of extensive combat experience. The officer in charge was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30, with the kind of face that might have been handsome under different circumstances. His eyes swept the monastery grounds with professional thoroughness, cataloging details that might prove significant later. When he spoke to his men, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. Hans had awakened at the sound of the approaching vehicles. When Marie Clare entered his room, she found him struggling to sit upright, despite the pain that movement obviously caused him. His face was drawn with effort, but his eyes held a clarity that had been absent during the fever-clouded days following his surgery. "You must go. Take off this bandage. Leave me as you found me. Tell them I crawled here to die and you discovered my body this morning. They will believe that story and trouble you no further." The selflessness of his proposal struck her like a physical blow. Here was a man willing to sacrifice his own chance at survival to protect the people who had risked everything to save him. The offer revealed a nobility of character that made her earlier decision to operate seem not just medically sound, but morally inevitable. She shook her head with a firmness that surprised them both. "We did not save your life so that you could throw it away at the first sign of danger. There must be another solution, another path through this crisis that preserves both truth and safety." But even as she spoke the words, Marie Clare knew that time was running short. The sound of boots on stone steps echoed through the monastery corridors, accompanied by voices speaking in rapid German. The search had begun, and it would be thorough, methodical, designed to uncover any secrets the ancient walls might harbor. Hans reached out and grasped her hand with surprising strength. His fingers were warm despite the chill that seemed to permeate everything in those winter days. And his touch carried a desperation that transcended language barriers. When he spoke, his voice held the urgency of a man who understood that some moments allow no second chances. "Listen to me carefully, sister. There is something you must know about the officer leading this search. His name is Major Wilhelm Kruger, and I served under his command for 8 months on the Eastern Front. He is not a cruel man, but he is utterly devoted to duty. He will show no mercy if he believes you have deceived him." The intelligence was both valuable and terrifying. Knowing their adversary's identity provided tactical advantage, but understanding his character suggested that conventional deceptions would prove inadequate. Major Kruger would not be satisfied with cursory explanations or surface appearances. He would dig deeper, ask harder questions, demand proof that could not be fabricated. Marie Clare found herself studying Hans's face with new intensity, searching for some solution that her medical training had not prepared her to find. The young German soldier had become more than a patient. He had become a symbol of everything she believed about the possibility of redemption, about the power of compassion to transcend the artificial boundaries that war imposed on human connection. The footsteps in the corridor were growing closer. Soon, very soon, Major Kruger would reach this room and discover the truth that would doom them all. Yet looking down at Hans Miller, seeing the quiet courage in his eyes, Marie Clare felt something unexpected stirring within her soul. Not fear, but a strange kind of peace that came from knowing she had chosen correctly regardless of the consequences that choice might bring. Hans seemed to sense the change in her demeanor. His grip on her hand tightened fractionally, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of wonder that transformed his entire expression. "You are not afraid. How is that possible when we face certain discovery?" The question forced her to examine emotions she had not taken time to analyze. Fear was certainly present, coiled in her stomach like a living thing, whispering of interrogation rooms and firing squads and the countless ways that mercy could be punished in a world gone mad with hatred. Yet beneath that fear lay something stronger, something that had been growing since the moment she first chose to see Hans as a human being rather than an enemy. Because I have discovered something about myself in these past days, something I did not know existed until circumstances forced it into the light. I am capable of love that transcends every rational consideration, compassion that recognizes no boundaries save those we create in our own hearts. If that discovery costs me my life, then it is still the most precious gift I have ever received. Hans stared at her in amazement, as if she had just performed a miracle more impressive than any surgical procedure. The transformation in his expression suggested that her words had touched something deep within his own understanding of what it meant to be human in the midst of inhumane circumstances. The sound of approaching boots reached the door of their corridor. Major Kruger's voice could be heard clearly now, questioning other patients, demanding explanations that seemed to satisfy his methodical approach to investigation. Marie Clare estimated they had perhaps 3 minutes before he reached Hans's room. 3 minutes to accomplish something that might preserve both their lives and their dignity. She moved to the small cabinet where medical supplies were stored and withdrew a vial of morphine, one of their most precious commodities. Hans watched her actions with growing understanding, his eyes reflecting both gratitude and sorrow for what she was about to sacrifice on his behalf. "This will make you appear unconscious, close to death from your wounds. Say nothing. Do nothing. Let me speak for both of us. Trust that God will guide my words when human wisdom proves inadequate." As she prepared the injection, Marie Clare found herself praying with an intensity that surprised her, not for miraculous intervention, but for the wisdom to navigate the next few minutes without betraying either her principles or the people who depended on her care. The morphine would buy them time, but time alone would not solve the fundamental problem of Hans's presence in their midst. The needle slipped into his arm with practiced ease, and she watched as the drug took effect with the swift efficiency that made it both blessing and curse in their primitive medical facility. Hans's eyes began to glaze, his breathing became shallow and labored, his entire body assuming the limpness of someone hovering between life and death. She had just finished adjusting his position when heavy footsteps stopped outside the door. Major Kruger's voice carried through the thin wood with crystalline clarity, and Marie Clare felt her heart skip as she recognized the tone of someone who had found exactly what he was looking for. "This room appears to be occupied. Why was I not informed that you are treating additional patients beyond those listed in your official reports?" The moment of truth had arrived, and with it came a clarity that surprised her with its completeness. Marie Clare straightened her shoulders, smoothed her habit, and walked toward the door with steps that betrayed none of the turmoil churning within her soul. Behind her, Hans Miller lay motionless as death. His survival now depended entirely on her ability to convince a suspicious German officer that mercy and deception were not necessarily the same thing. She opened the door to find Major Kruger standing in the threshold, his pale eyes already scanning the room beyond her shoulder. He was indeed younger than she had expected, with premature lines around his eyes that spoke of decisions no man should have to make before his 30th birthday. When his gaze met hers, she saw intelligence tempered by experience, authority balanced by something that might have been conscience. "Major, I am Sister Marie Clare. I oversee medical care for this facility." The patient in this room was brought to us 3 days ago by local villagers who found him unconscious in the forest. His wounds are severe, and I fear he may not survive another night." The explanation was truth carefully pruned of dangerous details, and she delivered it with the calm authority that came from years of medical practice. Major Kruger listened without interruption, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts as he processed her words against whatever intelligence had brought him to their door. When she finished speaking, he stepped past her into the room, his boots clicking against the stone floor with mechanical precision. His examination of Hans was thorough, but respectful, the actions of a professional soldier rather than a sadistic interrogator. Marie Clare found herself holding her breath as he lifted the blanket to examine the surgical site, his trained eye taking in details that might reveal more than she intended. "This man has received expert medical care. The surgical technique is sophisticated, the wound cleaning thorough. Such treatment suggests significant investment of time and resources. Why would you expend such effort on a dying stranger?" The question struck at the heart of everything Marie Clare had been struggling to understand about herself and her calling. Major Kruger's tone was neutral, almost curious, but she sensed that her answer would determine not just Hans's fate, but the fate of everyone under the monastery's protection. Because that is what we do here, Major. We heal without regard for politics or nationality or any consideration beyond the preservation of human life. This man was dying when he arrived, and our faith compels us to offer aid to all who seek it. Major Kruger studied her face with the intensity of someone trying to read a document written in a foreign language. The silence stretched between them until Marie Clare began to wonder if her heart's beating was audible in the small room's confines. Finally, he spoke with a deliberation that suggested careful consideration of multiple factors. "I have been told that this facility treats French resistance fighters and Allied soldiers. Such activities constitute treason under military law. Yet, I find only wounded men receiving medical care from dedicated religious personnel. Perhaps my informants were mistaken about the nature of your operations here." The words carried layers of meaning that took Marie Clare a moment to fully comprehend. Major Kruger was offering her an opportunity to retreat from dangerous ground, to accept a face-saving interpretation that would allow all parties to maintain their positions without forcing a confrontation that could only end in tragedy. She felt a surge of gratitude mixed with confusion. This German officer, whom Hans had described as utterly devoted to duty, was choosing to see only what his conscience could accept, rather than what his training demanded he uncover. Perhaps the war had taught him, as it had taught her, that some truths were more important than regulations, some choices more significant than orders. "Our mission here is purely medical, Major. We treat all patients according to their needs, not their affiliations. I hope you will find our documentation satisfactory and our practices beyond reproach." Major Kruger nodded slowly, his gaze returning one final time to Hans's motionless form. For a terrifying moment, Marie Clare thought she saw recognition flicker in his eyes, some memory or association that might shatter the delicate fiction they were constructing together. But when he spoke again, his voice carried only professional courtesy. "Your patient appears gravely ill. I trust he will receive the same excellent care you provide to all who seek sanctuary within these walls. Good day, sister." He turned and walked from the room with measured steps that gradually faded into the distance. Marie Clare remained frozen in place until the sound of truck engines starting told her that the search party was departing. Only then did she allow herself to sink into the chair beside Hans's bed, her legs suddenly too weak to support her weight. The morphine was already beginning to wear off, and Hans's eyes flickered open with returning awareness. When he saw her face, understanding dawned slowly, followed by an expression of wonder that seemed to illuminate the entire room. He let us live. Major Kruger discovered the truth and chose to walk away. Why would he do such a thing? Marie Clare found herself smiling through tears she had not realized were falling. The question Hans posed was one she suspected would occupy her thoughts for years to come, but in this moment, the answer seemed beautifully simple. Because even in the darkest times, even when hatred seems to have conquered everything good in the world, human beings remain capable of choosing mercy over vengeance, understanding over condemnation. Major Kruger saw what he needed to see and chose to be guided by conscience rather than regulation. In doing so, he reminded us all that hope is never truly lost, as long as people like him exist on both sides of every conflict. The crisis had passed, but its resolution had created new complexities that neither of them was prepared to address. Hans was recovering, but he could not remain hidden indefinitely. Major Kruger had shown mercy, but other officers might prove less accommodating. The war continued its relentless march, and eventually decisions would have to be made about Hans's future that went far beyond medical considerations. Yet in this moment of unexpected reprieve, Marie Clare allowed herself to feel something she had almost forgotten existed. Not just relief, but genuine hope for the possibility that love could indeed triumph over hatred, that mercy could find fertile ground even in the harshest soil, that the human spirit possessed resources of compassion that no amount of warfare could completely exhaust. Hans reached for her hand again, his touch gentle but insistent. When she met his eyes, she saw reflected there the same fragile hope that was growing within her own heart, the same recognition that they had witnessed something miraculous in Major Kruger's choice to see mercy rather than betrayal in their actions. Sister Marie Clare, whatever happens in the days ahead, I want you to know that you have given me something more precious than life itself. You have restored my faith in the possibility that goodness can survive even the worst that humanity can devise. That gift will sustain me regardless of what the future holds. His words settled over her like a benediction, confirming what she had begun to suspect about the true nature of her calling. She had thought her mission was to heal bodies broken by war, but she was discovering that her greatest gift lay in mending souls wounded by hatred and despair. In saving Hans Muller's life, she had somehow managed to save a part of herself that she had not realized was in danger. Marie Clare's story reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, the choice between compassion and indifference remains ours to make. Her decision to see Hans Muller not as an enemy, but as a suffering human being, created ripples that extended far beyond one monastery's walls. Sometimes the greatest victories are not won on battlefields, but in quiet moments when ordinary people choose extraordinary grace. In our own lives, we too face moments that test whether we will build bridges or walls between ourselves and those we are taught to fear.